Hello. The title of this lecture is The Modern Western State. And what I'm going to be talking about is the political developments in Europe after the medieval period. There were two models of European political development that emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries: royal absolutism and parliamentary monarchy presented two very different approaches to government. And actually, each served as a model for other European countries in the future. Absolutism is autocratic government unrestrained by law. The power of most absolute monarchs was inherited and was supposed to derive from God's will. Because rulers believed that they received their power from God, they saw their authority as absolute. Unlike medieval governments, absolute rulers were not restrained by the church, the nobility, and by their own financial limitations. During the Middle Ages, local government possessed extensive powers of economic control. Local governments regulated the economy with road tolls and tariffs, and these were on any goods that were coming into a district or jurisdiction, but also goods that were leaving that jurisdiction. As for wages and prices, they were regulated by local guilds of merchants and artisans. With absolutism, there was a transfer of the many local powers to a central government which sought to unify the state both politically and economically. Absolute monarchies introduced a permanent bureaucracy, national taxation, and standing armies. That's just to sum up the difference here. In the medieval period, you had control locally by local figures. And this was economically and also, for the most part, politically. With absolutism, there was the transfer of those local powers to a more national government. Absolute rulers created new state bureaucracies to direct the economic life of the state. The key purpose of the bureaucracy, which was typically composed of career officials appointed by the king, was to devise methods to raise revenue. The economic approach of the day was mercantilism. The mercantile style of system, the mercantile system saw the world's wealth as more or less fixed. In other words, the wealth of the world was finite. Another way of putting it is that there was one big economic pie, and the strategy of a particular nation was to take a bigger slice of that pie, biggest as possible. Thus, the other nations would have smaller slices of pie. Again, they saw wealth as fixed. They didn't see it grow. They did not have the idea of a pie growing. In other words, as an economy growing. Wealth was fixed. Well, to this end, mercantilists encourage exporting goods and importing less goods. So they wanted to export more goods and bring in fewer goods. In fact, governments penalize imports. The idea was for political leaders to enable a nation to export more than it imports, quote, causing a net inflow of gold to pay for the difference, end of quote. Mercantilists were not interested in maximizing standard living of their nation. Their goal was to gain a competitive advantage in combined wealth over other nations. The main objective was to increase their possession of gold, thus deter other nations from going to war against them. And this idea actually had been around for centuries. Accumulating gold was something that feudal lords did in the medieval age. A feudal lord's war chest was security for anticipated and unexpected hostilities. Now, absolutism adopted this thinking, but they set it up on the national level. Absolute governments embrace national taxation. To support a standing army and wars, a national system of tax collection was created. Monarchs wanted independent power, and an important step was achieving economic independence. Now, as far as the armies, yes, the absolute governments expanded their armies. Unlike in the past, when armies were formed temporarily for particular activities, for particular situations, military activities, 17th century kings maintained armies on a permanent basis. In other words, armies were not just set up to deal with some temporary disturbance or confrontation with hostiles. They were to be set up to be permanent, and thus they would be intact even during peacetime. Absolute monarchs used such armies for problems inside and outside. So, they used the armies for controlling any issues within their borders, but also obviously had them for fighting enemies from without. Now I want to look at the growth of absolutism as it took place in France. Medieval French kings maintained they were selected by God to rule. This is known as the theory of divine right of kings. The earlier French kings, however, were not absolute rulers, since they consulted and relied on others to administer the government. In the late medieval period, French kings began to consolidate more power, and that meant that there was less consultation with others. They did not need the support of as many aristocrats, for example. In securing additional power, the French eliminated the threat of competing religious ideas. And so what happened is, and this is the kind of the showdown between Catholicism and Protestantism. By the end of the 16th century, the French Civil Wars ended with Roman Catholic victory over the French Protestants, also known as Huguenots. Now, gone was the decentralizing aspect of Protestantism. The churches were under the authority of the king, and thus religion was subordinate to the state. During the reign of Louis XIII, which took place in the year 1610 to the year 1643, the monarchy began to establish greater control. The power of the central bureaucracy increased while the power of independent towns decreased. There were royal commissioners called intendants, one for each of the 32 districts. Decreasing the power of the nobility as councillors boosted the authority of the king. And what we see beginning with Louis the 13th was preventing the great lords from sitting in the king's council. Again, we see the greater consolidation of power, and this power does not have to depend as much on the support of aristocrats as had been in the past. Certainly the high point of absolutism in France was the reign of the Sun King, the reign of Louis XIV. He was only 4 years old when his father died, and his mother, with the assistance of Jules Mazarin, ruled France until Louis before he hit 22. So at age 22, Louis became king. So we have Louis XIV actually becoming a very powerful ruler. And he declared, quote, "I am the state," end of quote. Louis saw the state become involved in all the main activities and functions of society. And King Louis ruled absolutely, relying on a bureaucracy of approximately 1,000. The aristocrats' political power checked, they were no longer influential advisors. Now, with Louis XIV, there were many accomplishments. The king installed the royal court at Versailles. Once a small royal hunting lodge, it was transformed to become the grandest palace in Europe. Montesquieu declared that there were, quote, "more statues in the king's palace gardens than there are citizens in a large town," end of quote. So many statues, but there were also many fountains. There were 1,400 fountains that were fed by a diverted river, and this all added to the splendor of Versailles. Another achievement by Louis XIV was the expansion of the army. The army increased in size from approximately 100,000 to 400,000. In fact, even by 1670, the French army was the largest in Europe. The army became more professional, which included the addition of architects and engineering experts. The captains and generals were under the king's personal authority. During the reign of Louis XIV, there was no challenge to absolutism, and one can find two main reasons for this. One, order was established through military strength. The peasantry could not expect to initiate a successful revolt when the king's army numbered about 400,000. And two, the aristocrats did not revolt. Although they certainly lost political power, they gained economically by way of land. Individual members of the aristocratic class who steadily lost political rights of representation did register economic gains by acquiring land. In the end, the greater challenge to French absolutism in the 17th century was the cost of the king's military exploits that continued into the 18th century. There were three negative features of French absolutism. First, there were the huge debts. Advances in military technology increased the cost of warfare. In the end, it was King Louis' desire for international conquest that drained the royal treasury. For example, the War of the Spanish Succession, which took place from 1701 to 1713, was one of several wars that resulted in huge debts. This war was France against Holland, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. And so this is again France, picking fights with these nations. Mercantilism was not a good system, not a good economic system. Short of revenue, the French government set high taxes, but this high taxation caused greater poverty among the masses. So that was one serious shortcoming of absolutism. Second was that the Edict of Nantes was revoked. Now, this edict had given French Protestants a certain degree of religious freedom, but that was to be no more. In the absolute state, there was greater persecution of Protestants. Absolutism had no tolerance for religious diversity. Finally, absolutism brought increased surveillance and control of society. There were government spies to police any misbehavior. So this was not a very popular arrangement. When King Louis XIV died, one commentator wrote, quote, "Those wearied by the heavy and oppressive rule of the king and his ministers felt a delighted freedom. Paris found relief in the hope of liberation. The provinces quivered in delight, and the people, ruined, abused, despairing, now thank God for a deliverance which answered their most ardent desires." End of quote. Excuse me. Rather than the absolutism of late 17th century France, England developed into a constitutional monarchy. Constitutional monarchy represented a balance between the power of the monarch and the rights and liberties of the subjects. Although the king or queen was the head of the state with certain powers, the sovereign power rested with the subjects. Constitutionalism represented the limitation of government by law. The English Constitution included parliamentary statutes and judicial decisions. From the time of the Norman invasion of England in 1066, Norman kings adopted a policy of consultation. High-ranking church and aristocrats were consulted on the affairs of the kingdom. In the mid-1200s, these consultations became known as parliaments. from the word parleys. Parliament became a permanent fixture of English government by the 14th century. As a result of the Protestant Reformation, the power of Parliament increased. King Henry VIII needed the support of Parliament to initiate church reform. In the early 1600s, after Queen Elizabeth died, James I inherited the English throne. King James believed in the divine rights of kings. As I mentioned earlier, such thinking was that kings got their right to rule from God, not from the consent of the people. There was tension between King James and Parliament, and in general, tensions between two groups of English society. One group was the nobility, the court, and the other group was the gentry class, country without titles. Court refers to high-level nobles and clergy, whereas country refers to a rising agricultural and industrial entrepreneurial elite. This and you know the expression nouveau riche. These are the growing upper middle class and people who would acquire wealth, not through anything that was passed down from family, but as a result of their entrepreneurial success. And of course, they would not have any titles. Court and country were divided on political and religious lines. Court, represented by traditional bound aristocrats, favored the status quo, which would be the Church of England. Country, represented by commercial innovators, favored Protestantism, and a particular Protestantism, and that is Puritanism, which was a variant of Protestantism. And they were also supportive of Parliament. Country supporting Parliament, court supporting the royal government. King James I sought to establish a more absolute type monarch by centralizing the power of the government and giving the aristocracy new offices and titles to gain their support. In other words, what King James I was hopeful was that by flattering aristocrats with titles and giving them land, he could have their support, but what he would get in return would be more power. When James' son Charles I became king, conflicts between Parliament and the king continued, but at a more intense level, much more intense than had been the case with King James and Parliament. Charles followed the same strategy of his father. He wanted to eliminate country opponents, and that would be like the Puritans, those who were favoring Parliament. And just again, the Puritans should clarify that they were actually sort of like an English version of Calvinism. Maybe that would be a better way of explaining this group. So they were clearly dissenters within Protestantism. They were not part of the Church of England. They wanted to actually purify the church. They wanted to see it change. They objected to a number of different characteristics of the Church of England. For example, they were very critical of any Christian point coming out of the Church of England that was not supported by Scripture, any issues. And this included like the elaborate vestments, the ceremonial robe, liturgy, particular rites. Anything that was not clearly spelled out in the Bible was not approved by the Puritans. From the year 1629 to the year 1640, Charles did not allow Parliament. And so basically he attempted to shut Parliament down, and indeed Parliament was not in operation. But also he attempted to collect taxes without the consent of Parliament, but he was unsuccessful at this. And the three groups that opposed him were the Puritans, lawyers, and members of the House of Commons. And they united. They united against the king. And they sought to limit the power of the king. In November of 1640, Charles had no choice but to summon Parliament, since he required money to finance the army. There was a rebellion in Scotland caused when the Church of England attempted to impose a new prayer book on the Presbyterians in Scotland. So there is this rebellion in Scotland. The King Charles, he needs money, so he recalls Parliament, he summons Parliament. But Parliament not only refused the King's request for money, they demanded greater rights. And four in particular. They wanted to see that Parliament had greater say when it came to taxation policy. They also wanted to establish trial by jury, and this includes, and I have another point, habeas corpus. They wanted to see habeas corpus, a writ issued by a judge requiring an imprisoned person to be brought to a stated place at a stated time, usually to a court, for the legality of the imprisonment to be examined. So I have point 2, establish trial by jury, and then I have habeas corpus, which kind of fits within that category, but I have it separate. And fourth demand, they wanted a more reformed church. Again, they see some major weaknesses and shortcomings to the Church of England, and they want to see reform. There was no compromise between Charles and Parliament, and thus civil war broke out. So war began in 1642. Behind Parliament, supporting Parliament, was the New Model Army, commanded by a Puritan by the name of Oliver Cromwell. And I have from Ian Gentle's biography on Cromwell, we see an image of him, this painting of Oliver Cromwell. Eventually, the king met defeat and Parliament ordered his execution. Now, this was pretty serious. This was a momentous episode. To the House of Commons in late 1648, Cromwell declared, quote, "If any man whatsoever had carried on this design of disposing the king and disinheriting his posterity, or if any man had yet such a design, he should be the greatest traitor and rebel in the world. But But since the providence of God has cast this upon us, I cannot but submit to providence, though I am not yet provided to give you my advice. End of quote. Well, simply put, and soon it became clear that Cromwell wanted the king dead. The king refused to speak against those prepared to fight a future war. Notably, the Marquess of Ormond had mobilized an Irish army ready to support the king. So the king was given opportunities to have this army stand down and to be more cooperative, but he refused. Against the opposition of the House of Lords, the House of Commons formally indicted the king for treason. Now, for his part, he did not recognize the legality of the whole court episode. On January 30th, 1649, a crowd of thousands witnessed the unprecedented execution of an English king. And yeah, the account said there were thousands there packed to see this. And it was a shocking development. After the execution, Cromwell and other rulers quickly consolidated their power. And so what followed then was a commonwealth or a republican form of government. But a few years later, Cromwell found it increasingly difficult to work with Parliament. And after 1653, there was, for the most part, a military dictatorship. Oliver Cromwell, however, could not save his government. As historian Ian Gentles argues, the cost of his army bankrupted the government, and when Cromwell died in 1658, so too did the government. As was the case with most revolutionaries, quote, his achievements were chiefly destructive. In 1660, Parliament invited Charles II to become king and provide some leadership. And as it turns out, Charles ruled for 25 years, and he and the reason that he ruled as long as he did is that he was quite prudent. He did not direct the monarchy towards absolutism. In 1685, there's a new king. James II becomes king when Charles dies. James attempted to restore Roman Catholicism in England by packing Parliament and dismissing opponents. James also appointed Roman Catholics to positions in the army. Excuse me. Some aristocrats conspired against James and invited his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, Prince William of Orange, to invade England. I mean, this is quite remarkable. I mean, here we have James becoming king after Charles dies, and James really not learning from the kings before him, is really pushing it too far. He's dismissing opponents, and he's attempting to restore Roman Catholicism in England. And this led to the rather bold move for by the aristocrats in inviting Mary and her husband to come invade England. Well, what happened was that James was defeated. He was defeated in Ireland, and backed by Parliament, William and Mary became king and queen. So the plan was a success, and is referred this bloodless revolution, or and also known as the Glorious Revolution, resulted in a new public and political order. England reverted to a parliamentary government with William and Mary serving as the joint monarchs. What followed was a constitutional compromise, and some of the ideas were coming from John Locke. Well, 3 points I want to make. One, the notion of the divine right monarchy was destroyed. Now we see that ultimate power rests with Parliament. 2, for fair justice, the rights of habeas corpus and trial by jury were established. And 3, the Toleration Act of 1689. And what this act did was it granted all other Protestants the freedom to worship. And this was quite impressive, because up until this point, any other dissenting groups, Protestant groups, were viewed as not legitimate, and they lacked the freedoms that one would have if you were Church of England. I mean, the Church of England had dominated religious and political life since Henry VIII. But here we have the Toleration Act of 1689, and this grants all other Protestants freedom to worship. Groups such as, the Baptists or the Congregationalists and so forth. To conclude, France soldiered on under absolutism. France was a powerful state, but it experienced problems with the shortcomings of absolutism. And I didn't get too much into it, but economically, the absolutism really was not a good system for creating wealth and having a more prosperous economy. It tended just to favor some. It did not favor overall a nation. So without the revenues that the king would have liked to have had, there were problems with absolutism. England had witnessed a civil war and the rather extreme episode of the execution of the king, but the return to a parliamentary government did look promising. When we look back at the development of these two different governments, we see the absolutism versus the parliamentary monarchy. These two are become like a model for other nations in the following century, particularly like the 1700s. The 1700s is what I'm referring to, but two very different approaches to government. And in the long term, when one looks ahead in history, one sees that the constitutional monarchy was much more successful, and not only politically but also economically. And one can take a look at the economic state of France, for example, in the late 1700s, and how badly things were, which resulted in the French Revolution. But I'll end it there. Thank you very much.